special public lecture being presented by Dr. Regan Curran, which launches our 3rd annual McMaster Symposium on Education and Cognition. My name is Joe Kim, and I'll be your host for the evening's events. This event brings together researchers, educators, and policymakers to explore evidence-based practices in teaching and learning. And I'm grateful to the support of several campus partners who've helped out with our symposium from the inception, including the McMaster Institute for Innovation and Excellence in Teaching and Learning, the McMaster Alumni Association for sponsoring tonight's reception, and the Wine and Cheese to follow, and the Office of the President of McMaster University. As I watch my daughter growing up, I see a developing mind that is adventurous, stubborn, and most of all, curious. Monica is every bit of what they call a three-nager these days. She's 3.5 years old, going on 13 at least. And she's ready to explore the world and take on every challenge. In this case, the challenge set before her is the famous Marshmallow Test. The question is, can she resist the temptation to eat one marshmallow for the promise of a second marshmallow, double In truth, my wife and I have been training her for about 3.5 years for this very moment. And the question before us was really, will she give in to me today? I think this video also serves as good evidence that psychologists are not necessarily qualified to be parents. In September, Monica will be starting school officially, enrolled in junior kindergarten. She made it. And once she starts her formal education in school, one of the questions I'm asking myself as a parent is, will her teachers nurture that adventurous, stubborn, and curious mind that I've grown to just love observing every day? And will the structure of her school programs help her to remain curious as a student as you plan her university career and graduate school? And there are many questions that interest me as a parent, as a researcher, and as a teacher. Now, cognitive psychologists, I think, have a lot to add to this discussion. And tonight we'll be hearing from one of the leaders in the field, Dr. Regan Curran, who is working to bridge cognitive science and education. Immediately following this presentation, we've assembled a distinguished panel that will reflect upon Dr. Curran's presentation and the wider themes of the symposium. At this time, I'd like to call on President Patrick Dean, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to offer somewhat belatedly, given that I know there have been a number of workshops today, a welcome to everybody to this year's seminar, and in particular to welcome people who've come from outside of McMaster to participate. It's very gratifying to see that number continue to rise each year. It's tough to follow Monica. I think we all identify with what she goes through in that video, although none of us move at that speed anymore. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Regan A. Curran is the Ben J. and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Human Development and Psychology at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. He's published articles in a variety of scholarly journals, including Psychological Review and Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. He's authored a textbook called Health Psychology, A Cultural Approach, and is also the co-author or co-editor of 12 other books. He's the winner of numerous teaching awards, including the Case Wisconsin Professor of the Year, the UW Systems Regents Teaching Award, and the UW Green Bay Founders Award for Excellence in Teaching. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the Midwestern Psychological Association. He has served as president of the Society for the Teaching of Psychology and is the newly appointed founding editor of APA's journal, Circle in Psychology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Regan.
So there's the panel, I think, right? Or that's what's on next, yep. And we're back. That's what I want to talk about. And when I say the twain shall meet, even in the way that Joe set it up, when you look out there, we all care about education at some level. Whether you have kids, whether you're a teacher, no matter what, education's important, right? You look at what's going on in the world and you want people to be well educated. And there are a lot of places that you can look to find out how to educate people well. But when you take a look at who has the ownership of that, if anybody does, it's in a lot of different places, right? And what I want to do today is talk about some different places and how there really shouldn't be different places to look, and we need to be doing a lot better job of having one place. And so I grew up in Bombay. We read Rudyard Kipling a lot, and I remember East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. And it really occurred to me that for the most part, when you take a look at cognitive psychology or cognitive science and scholarship of teaching and learning, far too often they're at different poles. And I think that's something that I'd like to do something about. So you have journals such as this excellent journal, Learning, Memory, and Cognition, and more often than not, you see it at one end of the spectrum, and there'll be people who read it. At the other end of the spectrum, another fine journal, The Teaching of Psychology. But it's sort of at the other end of the spectrum. And what I've noticed is that far too often, readers of one don't always read the other, and vice versa. All right? And it's really easy to check this out. Just go into one of these articles, turn to the back where there's a reference section of where everything has been cited, and more often than not, Teaching of Psychology will cite The Teaching of Psychology, and more often than not, these journals will cite its own journal. Now, some authors are good enough to go beyond that, and I was proud to get on board with the brand new journal, Scholarship of Teaching, Learning, and Psychology. And what we try and do is sort of bridge this gap. I think there is that gap. And we're now well positioned to say, look, people, it's time to bridge this gap. Let's all talk together. If you're doing a study in the classroom, you should know about what's going on in cognitive labs. If you're doing a study in a lab, you should know what's going on in the classroom. All right? So let's get talking. It shouldn't be apart. Let's put it all together. So that's the big plan. So to get us there, I've divided this up into three parts, right? The classic, a couple of English folk, right? The classic three-act show. Part one is, let's talk a little bit about the science of learning, right? So I'm going to cover some definitional issues. I know we have a very wide spread of folks here. Let me get some definitions out of the way. And I'll say out of the way, because quite honestly, definitions often get in the way. Quite honestly, people spend far too much journal space debating what a definition should be. Am I doing the scholarship of teaching and learning? Oh, no, you're not. Oh, yes, I am. Oh, no, I'm not. If you want to have that argument, go someplace else. If you want to know about what influences learning, stay tuned, right? So that's part one. So what is learning, right? I'm going to talk about some key factors, spreading a bunch of different domains, and then the bulk of what I'm going to do here is really talk about what we know that works best. And as much as possible, I'm going to try and identify what's only from the lab, what's from the lab and the classroom, and in some places, what's only known in the classroom. All right? So that's the plan, definitions, what exactly is learning, and then what works best. So we can walk out of here with some ways to increase learning. Whether you're a teacher or a parent, and I love parent shots, right? I mean, aren't we thinking about it all the time? It's horrible being a psychologist as a parent. Let me tell you. Because every move they make, you're thinking, oh boy, did I do it right, right? It's even worse teaching intro psychology. I teach introduction to psychology. I can tell you the way I taught intro psych changed after I had kids. Because now I was like, oh, I'm putting this into action right at home. I'm going to go home, and this is not just something in the textbook. I've tried this. And most of the time it doesn't work, okay? And sadly, that's the case when you take some cognitive stuff from the lab and put it into the classroom, all right? So, part one, let's look at some definitional issues. There are a lot of terms out there. I've already mentioned a couple. You will hear of people talk of the science of learning. You will hear of cognitive science. And of course, you will hear of the scholarship of teaching and learning. Now, the science of learning has actually been around for some time. Carnegie Mellon, in the last few years, poured millions of dollars into a science of learning lab. And what's interesting about this little piece, this is a piece from when Carnegie Mellon launched it. I love the little subprint, and I'll read it for you. It says, first question, what exactly does that mean? All right? Science of learning is a big buzzword, but what exactly does it mean? So some people have, a couple of years ago, actually just last year, a couple of teachers brought out the new science of learning, a nice little booklet. It's the new science of learning, translating the science of learning into classroom applications. Sounds all very well and good. Sounds very translational, and we talked about translation in an early session today. But here are some key things to know about the science of learning, and I want to distinguish it in some ways from some of the other things. There's some overlap, like the classic Venn diagram. So you have the science of learning, and you have the scholarship of teaching and learning, and you have, let's put cognitive psychology on there. Some of you may want me to put education on there, pretend it's there, okay? But the big issue is the science of learning. When you think about the science of learning and you look at who's doing it, because as we sit down as teachers, we may go, wow, that sounds like good stuff. Learning, that's what I'm interested in. Give me the science. Somehow, all of us are always so much more, we pay so much more attention when there's some biology or some machine involved. You know, as a health psychologist, I can tell you, health psychologists have been telling people about stress for a very long time, right? And saying, look, it's psychological. There are so many psychological ways that influence stress. But then some biological thing comes around and all that psychological stuff is ditched. Right? When people don't feel good, they'd much rather pop a pill than try something that takes a little bit of work and mental power. Right? So the science of learning, lots of biology, lots of neuroscience, very, very cool stuff. But I'm going to give you a warning about it. Before we get too carried away, the reality is the science of learning right now is operating at a very different level from what is going on in the scholarship of teaching and learning and in the classroom. Right? So the scholarship of teaching and learning, you may say, well, what is that? It's research done on teaching and learning. Right? And if we can unpack it more, but essentially that's what it is. You look at what's going on in the classroom and you do some research on it, it's the scholarship of teaching and learning. Cognitive psychology, of course, is studying what's going on in the mind, but for the most part, until very recently, most cognitive psychology work was done in a lab. And what happened, it went something like this. We'd find something in the lab and then spread it without really mentioning that it was truly a lab study. Because people thought, why do you have to mention it's a lab study? Isn't that obvious? Well, what was happening is that people would take these lab studies in cognitive psychology and then step into their classroom and try and apply it and be disappointed when it didn't work. Life is not the same as a lab. That's why we go to the lab. Because what happens in a lab, we can control everything. Right? We, the researcher, can tweak and control so that only what we want to happen will happen. That's the power of a lab. But it takes away the magic of the real world, or the complexity, or the difficulty. So what's happening here is we've got to pay attention to the fact that especially between these two, most of this is done in the lab, most of this is done in the classroom, most of it. And most of the science of learning, at least at this point, really neat biological stuff, but at a level that's not really ready to go into the classroom. Okay? Daniel Willingham, and I love that picture, in his commentary on neuroscience applied to education, mostly unimpressive. All right? And here's why. Neuroscience is doing some excellent work. If you can pop somebody into an MRI machine and find out how their brain is firing when they're thinking something or when you're teaching them something, that's great. But there's so much more stuff going on that just that neuronal firing doesn't necessarily translate onto one specific thing you can point to. But yet, people who don't know enough neuroscience will look at the cool flashing of lights that the neuroscientists put out and go, look, I said this part of the brain lit up, we've got it. And what a lot of people are saying is, hang on, we're not there yet. So neuroscience and the science of learning, and the mostly biologists who do it, in a wonderful situation. They're getting great information, but for somebody who's a practitioner, somebody who's teaching, is a little bit of time before we can take that and actually put it to some use. So just something to watch out for and pay attention to. The science of learning, though, does, as I said, do a lot of good work. There was recently a review article that just came out earlier this year, published in Psychological Science, and Heuristic and colleagues say there are 4 main pillars of learning, from the science of learning. And for any of you who've wondered about apps and educational apps, and is there an app for that? They say, here is what the science of learning says about optimal learning and how good educational apps should be designed. All right? You need active involvement, engagement, something that gives the individual meaning, and something that provides social interaction. Okay? So if I were to summarize a lot of work from the science of learning into 4 take-home messages for educators, those are the 4. All right? And this was a great review article. Again, it's free online if you just Google that if you want some more details. But the big picture is the stuff to pay attention to. Right? If you want, excuse me, if you want learning, you want active involvement, you want engagement, you want meaning, you want social interaction. And some of these things like engagement and active involvement, yeah, you may go, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense, but there's also a really strong neurological basis to suggesting these things take place. Okay? If you don't want to go that far and read a technical journal, here's a free resource that the Society for the Teaching of Psychology put out just about a year ago. It is completely free, and it is, as you can see, applying the science of learning in education. Wonderful. It's an ebook. You can download it onto your iPad. Something like 25 or so chapters where different experts in the field have been explicitly asked to say, how does the science relate to learning in the classroom? So this is when you talk about translational, wonderful, wonderful piece, because it's truly the charge given to the authors would translate this into something that can be used. Okay, and again, free resource, one of the best go-tos for the science of learning out there. How about the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning? Well, as far as the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning goes, and I'll say a little bit more about it, this is the essence of what the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning is. Stephen Brookfield has this in the preface of his book, and I'll give you a second for that to soak in. What's the essence lying in? The essence is in the teacher constantly researching. And I think that is so important for us as educators. Don't just sit back. Don't just sit back and go, I've been trained well, I'm going to do it. We have got to be constantly paying attention to the experiences our students are having. How do the students make sense of what we're doing? What's going on in the environment that could be influencing the learning? It's that ongoing paying attention. I mean, that's why they say, oh, do you think you're a good teacher? Well, I think I'm a good teacher, but I'm still learning more things. We can't stop because there are so many more things that are out there. And as far as the Scholarship of Teaching goes, it's using this notion that the skillful teacher is not just paying attention to what's going on out there, but then making decisions based on it. The big picture. Again, many definitions on the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, but for the most part, this is the process. You reflect and review. How are your students learning? What's been done? What can be done better? You then pick something to change, right? So you say, oh, you know what? My assignments, I wish they could be writing better. Maybe I'll tweak my assignment on writing. Or maybe close reading. Oh, I'm not happy with how my students are doing close readings. I'd like them to do close readings better. Well, you find out what's been done on it, and then you decide to change it. Decide on some intervention. What are you going to do to intervene and increase or improve close reading? Now, here are the important parts. You may say, well, aren't those important? No, well, those are important too. But far too often we do this, but then we don't follow it through. Well, did it work? And when I say did it work, I don't mean, wow, they smiled at me more. I don't mean, wow, my student evaluations popped up. I don't even mean it looks like their close reading is better. I mean, we systematically and intentionally pay attention to the quality of their learning. That's what we need to do. We change something based on our reading, based on our reflection, and then systematically change it, right? And ask if it works. And if it works, follow that circle, publish it, or present it. Get it out there. Right? Because when we teach, we share something with teachers all over. We share so many challenges. Okay? If you have a certain problem, it's probably not just you, even though I bet you feel like it sometimes. Right? And I know, sometimes I go, wow, why can I not do this right? And I know it's not me. At least now, 16 years into it, I know it's not just me. Okay? Sometimes it's me. All right? Bad day. But most of the time, it's okay. Right? So, but that's the scholarship of teaching and learning, where you dig into stuff and you say, what's been done? What can I do about it? And then find out if it's done better. And as I said, that's the essence of a skillful teacher. Do all teachers have the time and energy to do it? I say we should really try and make the time and do what it takes to get the energy to do it, because it is so important to being a skillful teacher and to influence learning. So when I talk about learning, you may say, what exactly do you mean? Well, yeah, there are those definitions of science and so on and so forth. I've been playing with a very new conceptualization of at least how I like to represent learning. And to me, I use the term cultivating. What do I want to do? What's my goal? To cultivate learning. Why cultivate? Well, I think about the oysters, right? Think about how pearls are formed, right? You have natural pearls and then you have cultivated pearls. Left to their own devices, an oyster will create a pearl. But you got to get lucky, right? But human beings have now mastered the form of cultivating pearls. We know just how to introduce that fleck of sand, right? We know how to vary the chemical composition of the water around the oyster so we can get good cultivated pearls. Now, of course, this leads to a really strange metaphor for teaching, right? Why does a pearl form? Because something has irritated the oyster. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay irritating my students to think. Because far too often, they will sit back and say, give it to me. And I want them to think. And if I am the irritant that will make them learn or form that pearl, I'm okay with it. Okay? And it takes some guts. And some may say it takes tenure. Okay? Okay? And at least I have both right now, right? But I'd like you to think about that. Think about it. Learning as learning as a pearl. And what our goal is to cultivate it. How can we cultivate it? I want you to learn yourself. I don't want to spoon feed it. Right? I want you to cultivate it yourself. And I'll stimulate you to get going, but then it's up to you. All right? So this has some really neat implications as I approach my teaching. When I say cultivation, cultivate learning, I mean not only memorization. Many educators know about Bloom's taxonomy. We don't want folks to be down here. We want them to go all the way up. Right? Sometimes, and Joe, you may have taught this yourself when you teach a big intro psych class, but I don't have time to do anything more than multiple choice. Right? Can you really cultivate learning and move them up Bloom's taxonomy with multiple choice questions? Well, actually, yeah. Right? Some of you may have, if you haven't seen this, I would Google this the next time you're near a computer. Steven Pinker teaches intro psych at Harvard, and think about this, his intro psych exam questions were published in the New York Times. That's a pretty cool place to get psychology out there. And his questions are great. They're multiple choice, but they get students to think. Okay, they get students to think. And, you know, my challenge the next time I teach intro is I want sexy questions like Pinker questions, okay? Because mine aren't as good. I mean, he's got comics and all that kind of stuff. So I think you can cultivate learning. And why is it not just memorization? Because memorization's not working. A good friend of mine, Eric Landem, and I did a study on memorization in introductory psychology. And we looked at the percent correct. How much do students in intro psych remember? And at the end of the semester, do you have a guess, sir? What percent?
20%.
20%? Anybody? Please, we do a better job of teaching than that, right? Give me another guess. What do you think, sir? 30? Well, good news, ladies and gentlemen, 80%. Woohoo! At the end of the semester, after I have busted my behind teaching, they remember about 80%. And mind you, this is an exam on the last day after about 3 days of heavy cramming. So not much of a surprise. The big question is, what about 2 years later? It really drops down to a fail. And in America, 60% is a fail, all right? They are remembering 2 years later, they're basically getting an F, okay? And then we asked ourselves to be fair, but come on, it's been 2 years later. How many, they're not thinking about their course all the time. How about psychology majors who've been thinking about psychology all the time? They're going to do better, right? So we went to a senior course. They've been taking psychology for all the years since their intro psych class. Not much better, okay? Sort of sad. They barely pass. A D, intro psych. And I think, wow, is this why I've spent so much energy, those 14 weeks teaching intro psych, for them to remember about 60% 2+ years later? And that's why I go, no, memorization, that's not my goal. If you cultivate learning, all right, it's going to be better. Another nice way to think about it is, even this exam right here, to be quite honest, I said, gosh, look at these scores. This is horrible. And then I was reminded of some good cognitive psychology that said, wait a minute, performance on multiple choice exams is not learning, it's performance. What a great distinction. I felt so much better, okay, for the most part, right? Because what's happening is, far too often, all right, what's truly learning? Relatively permanent changes in comprehension, understanding, and skills. So that data I just showed you, I have pretty decent performance in intro psych, but horrible learning, right? And that's sort of scary. So there's good news, bad news. Ooh, good performance. Ooh, bad learning. Okay? So if we really care about cultivating learning, we need to go beyond this. For the cognitive psychologists or the cognitive scientists in the room, the neat thing about this distinction, and this is a great article, also came out earlier this year, nicely uses a lot of cognitive science. The notion of desirable difficulties, the notion of the reloading hypothesis, the notion of the new theory of disuse. All of it gets at the fact that what you and I need to do for learning is different from what you and I need to do for good performance. And I think let me underline the key message for the educators and those who care about teaching. Is what you're doing getting you better performance, or is it actually cultivating learning? That's what I want you to hang on to. And tweet, okay? That's the deal, all right? Are you really aiming for learning, or are you just going for performance? That's what's become so important. And you may notice that if you haven't run into the term desirable difficulties before, very, very neat stuff. Robert Bjork out at UCLA basically said, we've got to make learning tough, all right? But at the right level of difficulty, the so-called desirable difficulty. Because when you hit that desirable difficulty, then students will learn more. And I thought, hey, that fits in pretty nicely with my oyster pearl irritant metaphor. So that's the key. We want to cultivate learning. We want to cultivate learning, not just performance. All right, end of Act 1. Act 2. If that's what we're going for, cultivating learning, right? What are the key factors? Well, here are some things to keep in mind. Right? There are lots of individual differences and lots of environmental differences that we have to also take into account. I have 2 kids. Liam is 9 and Melina is 7. And even as you can see from this picture, they are very different. Those are personality. What you see there, I have tried to replicate in different situations, and unfortunately, these personality differences are replicated over and over. He's the smiley guy, she's the what you talking about, right? Or more often, no picture, Dad, right? But that goes to departments. That's my psychology department. We are mostly smiley people, right? But we even have a lot of individual differences in how we teach. And then you expand that, of course, into the classroom. All right? And every time you look into a classroom, we've got all these things going in there. So I like to acknowledge the fact that you and I who teach, wow, we are trying some pretty difficult stuff. Because we are even above the individual differences and the environmental differences, we still want to cultivate learning. That's setting ourselves a pretty nice high goal, right? Lot different from, hey, take these 20 terms and memorize them in the lab and let's see if we recognize them. Control is great in the lab, the real world is hard, okay? And not surprisingly, there's tons of stuff that predict learning, okay? All you need to know, big picture, lots of arrows. Yeah, learning is complex. All right? There are lots of situational factors. This model of teaching came out of the undergraduate of a major conference held by the APA that created the so-called blueprint for undergraduate learning in psychology. And a group of science, of scholar researchers sat down and said, here are some major factors that influence learning. Now if you go, oh, that's too many boxes, I don't like boxes. Okay, I'll give you something else. All right? And actually one I like a lot better, narrowing it down a little bit. Jim Grosha down at Auburn University said, well, a nice way to think about it is, here's learning that you want to get to, and here are all the key processes that we need to keep in mind, right? There's learner variables, there's differences in teaching technique, there's classroom design, there's a lot of stuff. And as you sit there and you go, oh, I'd like to do something different, Well, you can choose any one of these places to start. And again, lots of good news, lots of places to start. You may go, I don't want to change what I'm doing. Okay, fair enough. Not ready for that yet? Well, focus someplace else. You and I, as educators, or anybody who wants to cultivate learning, has a lot of choice in where we can start to make that difference. All right? Here are some of the big ones. I decided if you were to say, hey, come on, you're doing this big talk on a lot of things making a difference, give me the big ones. Well, here you go, people. When you talk about learning, these folks here, and this represents a lot of research, some of them are major studies, some of them are meta-analyses or combinations of a lot of studies, basically say, look, this is the big thing, all right? You have motivation, you have habits, you have ability and effort, you have self-efficacy, you have social support, and you have goals. Okay? Pay attention to these features or factors, and you can influence learning. All right? And if you want any more on each of these, I should also add, I have a full sheet of references for all of these things for those of you who want to dig up some of these studies. All right? So just email me, I'll send you all the references for everything that I've talked about in this little bit. So yeah, you look at that, wow, where do you start? There's a whole bunch of stuff influencing learning. It's not impossible. David Daniel, who spoke here, my friend Eric Landrum and I did a study on around the nation. We looked at intro psychology in about 34 different universities around America, and we said, let's take these factors and see which of these can predict learning. And we found that the biggest predictor, not surprisingly, is ability. And we use GPA as predictor. No big surprise. The student's GPA is a big predictor of their score in intro psych. Here's one that we paid a lot of attention to. To what extent does the student, and Arshad, you mentioned Noel Entwistle, which I loved hearing that because not enough people talk about his work. He's done a lot of work on depth of processing. Depth of processing makes a big difference. You ask students, when you read something, or when you read something, what do you do with it? Do you basically chew on it and think about it, or do you just go for the facts? A lot of students in intro classes are just going for the facts, doing what's called surface processing. And sure enough, that predicts their scores. Surface processors, the more they process on the surface, the worse they do. Okay? Study time, metacognition, right? How much do they think about their thinking? Another big feature, right? The more students think about what they know and what they don't know, right, and then do something about it, the better the prediction of their grades. And of course, in this case, one of our predictors that we put in last was the extent to which they practiced. All right, and I'll come back to the use of practice. But this was a classroom study. All students in the classroom, we used, for across these 34 universities, we used the same benchmark quiz so that we had a common quiz no matter where the students were. Yeah?
What is the critical aspect?
So this is these are different predictors put into a multiple regression equation. So
You didn't predict 90-something% variability.
no, so those are individual, right. So it's more like just an easy summary. That was all the different things in there, absolutely, right? So these are big chunks. So that's just to give you about how much percents of unique variance, or not unique, I should say, percents of the variance that they got at, okay? So when you look at that, you may say, okay, great, but come on, how much of it is the student? How much of it is the teacher? Well, we actually have one way of getting at that. John Hattie, who's now at the University of Melbourne, did some great work where he did a meta-analysis. And what that is he took 800 meta-analyses and then he meta-analyzed them, right? And then he maybe not once and for all, but at least for now, gives us the answer to the question, to predict learning, to what extent do the different things that we do predict student learning? And what he found was that the biggest chunk, 53%, was the student. Yeah, that makes good sense. It's up to you, student. But notice, it's only, and I like to say only, it's only 53%. I talk to too many educators who say, hey, come on, student, do it. Do it all. I think that may be a little unrealistic, okay? The amount of variance predicted by just the student, 53%. What about instructors? Okay, what about instructors? About 26%, okay? 26%. So those of us who step into the classroom, almost a quarter of learning is up to us on average, okay? And that's a loose translation of the meta-analysis, all right? But still, we are responsible for a pretty significant amount of what's going on in that classroom. There are a whole bunch of other factors as well. And if you want more of the data, this was published in our first issue of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Right? Really glad to have it in the first issue. Landmark bit of data in there. But I always think about this. When I am tired, when I am frustrated with students and go, come on, you do more, I go, yeah, you know what? A good chunk is still me. All right, a good chunk is still me. So I think something that really inspires me to make sure I watch what I do. Okay? All right, as promised, Act 3. So what can we do about it? All right? Interestingly enough, a lot of people care about learning. All right? Ken Bain, a couple of years ago, wrote a book called What the Best College Students Do. I was very happy to note that as a psychologist, I learned nothing. Okay? And I mean that in a good way. I mean, he talked about psychological research. Right? It's stuff that I bet most people in this room have read most of the studies in this book. But it was really neat to see them in one neat place. And it so nicely showed that we scientists don't do a good enough job of talking about research. We don't do enough translation. This book is a great translational book. Okay? It translates tricky stuff and gets it out there. Last year was a landmark year. 2 books on learning came out. All right? Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning and How We Learn. Again, if you're new to this area, super reads. Where would I start? I would actually start here. Even though many of you cognitive scientists would recognize Roediger and McDaniel, I think this one still does a more comprehensive job. Okay? So there's good stuff out there. So right off the bat, you can pick up, go to the Amazon Canada and say, hey, I want to skim some of this stuff. Really good stuff out there. But let's go beyond that. Right? Let's go beyond that. Let me show you some actual view from the ground. I've been asking a lot of questions over the years about what really works in class, and I'm just going to walk you through some highlights of some findings that I have that I think or nicely illustrate that classroom research can be really useful stuff. This is probably one of the oldest studies, but it's one of the ones that really woke me up to the fact that classroom research is essential to do in addition to lab research. I looked at the extent to which my students in intro psych used outlines, bold-face terms, review questions, and key terms in addition to a whole number of other pedagogical aids. And I correlated it. I looked at the association between these ways of studying with exam score. And a simple way to interpret this is as you get up either this way or this way, the association is stronger, all right? And significance or not, that's a separate question which I'll tell you. Only 2 of these findings were significant. Actually, all these up here, all 4 over here were significant. The non-significant findings I haven't even shown you, they were non-significant. Out of asking students, hey, which of these things do you do to study and how does it relate to your exam scores? 4 things were significant. Now, those of you who understand correlations, you may say, wait a minute, is that a mistake? Shouldn't those be positive correlations? Shouldn't it be a positive association? Shouldn't it be the more you use key terms, the better you do in the exam? It should, but it wasn't. All right? The more students used key terms, the worse they did in the exam. Okay? And if I just found this once, I would have thought, oh, anomaly. But as any good scientist should do, I replicated and replicated again and replicated again. I did it 4 times. And in every study, key terms were negatively correlated to learning. Something I like to call dangerous detours. I think our students think they know what they should be doing, but spend too much time on the wrong thing. Is key terms bad? No. But don't spend too much time doing using key terms. Okay? And you see this pattern over and over again. Here's, how much do you do these things? I asked students. I said, how much do you do these things? And this is in descending order of how students study. And you will notice over here, most of these techniques are repetition. Down, the less used techniques are cognitive and metacognitive. Okay? But the things our students do the most are just pure repetition. Does it matter? Yes, it matters. These positive correlations here, the only positive associations, and I see my labels are not showing up, but the only positive correlations were between testing your knowledge, studying with a friend, making up examples. Right? All stuff that students don't do too much of. So they're doing it, but they're not doing it enough. All right? And again, classroom research, again, replicated in a number of different studies. So it's not just a one-shot kind of deal. I think if I were to generalize what cognitive psychology says in general, metacognition is something you'll hear over and over again. One book that makes the rounds is 7 Habits of Successful Learners by Ambrose and colleagues that came out about 5 years ago. And they nicely say, look, at the heart of it, this is what students should be doing. Okay, this is what students should be doing. They should be reflecting, okay? They should be reflecting on what they know, assess how much they know, evaluating the effects of their studying, planning a way of studying, applying it, and then following through that sequence. Next, very, very few students do this. And why? Because it's not necessarily intuitive. What do most of our students do? They wait until a couple of days before the exam and they study. Is that a good strategy? Well, you nodded, but actually yes. It's a great strategy for performance. If you want to do well on the next day's exam, cramming works. But it fades and it decays. That's why that distinction between learning and performance is so important. Cramming works for performance. If I have to dance tomorrow, cramming my steps tonight will work. Okay, that may not be a good analogy, I'm not a dancer, but let's go with it. Okay? But so cramming works. It's hard to tell students don't cram because students have tried it and it seems to work, but it's a lot harder to say, oh, please study the right way and you'll thank me for it later. Yeah, right, sure. Yeah, that's great motivation. So I think this is great in theory, but how do we do it? So let me take the last 10 or so minutes and say, here are some key things that you can do, right? A lot of these are pulled from cognitive psychology, and I've oriented most of these in very pragmatic. Here are some things you can try. And again, there should be a little asterisk. Individual results may vary, okay? Let's be fair. But for the most part, here are some things that work pretty well. Number one, start early. I think something that's really, really important to get our students to do is to ask questions early. Okay? And I think early is important. Far too often, I see my students will wait till a day or a few hours before a deadline to ask me a question about the assignment. I'm so glad you're asking for clarification, but why didn't you ask me a week earlier? Okay? I mean, start early, all right? We need to get students to start early. Where's this coming from? Metacognition. We need to get students to know earlier what they don't know, all right? And if the only way to know earlier what they don't know is if they have a good sense of what the assignment is, right? And in class, I often, especially in intro psych, I love saying, show me the data. I say, don't just take a finding, look for the data. And if you're a good critical thinker, you should be able to look at the data and bring your own conclusions. And for years I would do this, and I love the fact that there were probably some people sitting there going, what the heck does that mean, right? And same thing with correlations. I think especially if you've been teaching for some time, sometimes we take certain terms for granted. A correlation is just an association. Oh, that seems so easy to me because I know correlations well. But a correlation or even a statistical association, a linkage between two things, is not that intuitive to a first-year student. Okay? And taking more time on it is important. So getting whatever you can do to get students to question earlier. It may be an early quiz, it may be an early assignment, but get them to question things earlier. Okay, Amy mentioned, Amy somewhere, I saw Amy someplace, so she was mentioned when we did the live lab tour that she's looking at mind wandering. Target mind wandering, that's a really big deal, right? Just earlier, in our second issue, I think we had an article from Dan Schachter at Harvard who did a study on helping students regulate what they're paying attention to. Because the reality is, minds wander. Some of your minds have wandered, okay? Some of you are thinking, should I get up now to go to the bathroom, right? We had that conversation earlier. But for minds do wander. There you are, Amy, right? Yeah, mind wandering, right? But targeting mind wandering, we know it happens. We know it happens. Why don't we do something about it, right? Why don't we do something about it? Because more often than not, we haven't thought about it consciously, okay? But target mind wandering, that's a really big deal, something that you can do. I'm thinking most of you run into mindsets, but there's a nice thing, change mindsets, right? And the reason I bring it up now, even if you've heard about it, is because for the first time, we've seen a wonderful example of lab research in the real world. Psychological Science earlier this year published a great intervention study where Pinescu and colleagues went to, if I'm remembering correctly, 1,500 high schools, all right? And they did a very simple intervention. Half step back, what is a mindset? Most of us have an idea about intelligence. Some of us believe that intelligence is fixed, all right? Some of us believe that no, intelligence is dynamic and you can grow. This actually is extremely important because if you have a fixed mindset and you do poorly on an exam, you will actually study less for the next exam. Disturbing stuff, okay? And I'll say that again. Studies show that students with a fixed mindset in the face of failure actually decrease effort instead of increasing effort. That has some really serious consequences, all right? And what these folks did is they created I believe it was a 45-minute video that they shipped to all these high schools and had students watch it, and lo and behold, they showed changes in learning. And I think that's pretty impressive. One of my goals this fall is to take that video and use it in my college classes and see if we can pull off the same thing, all right? So you may have heard about mindsets before, but the good news is there's an intervention out there that seems to be working. Needs some more work in the classroom, but it's out there and we can use it. I think finding the right motivational tool is pretty important too. Amy, again, in our live lab tour, you mentioned the word gamification, right? And gamification is actually an interesting thing to look at. I had the pleasure of writing a few chapters in a book that just came out earlier this year on gamification in education. People from a whole bunch of different disciplines, including math and computer science and so on, we all addressed the question, how can we best use gamification in the classroom? And we talked about in terms of curriculum, we talked about in terms of assessment, and the whole notion here is not just make your class a video game. No, it goes way beyond that. There are whole ways that you can use the underlying techniques behind video games. The earning badges, the leveling up, the challenges. There are folks who actually changed their syllabi so that their syllabi more represents the rules of a game. And you process through class and learning, earning badges. And the neat thing is, if you have a student who's not challenged by what you're doing, and they've earned their badge, they can go on and do something else. So you don't have some students who go, this is too easy. By the same token, the students who find certain things hard, you know if they haven't earned a certain badge in that area. Now, an interesting way to think about things in a slightly different way. So very often, some folks are playing with the use of badges as a sign of achievement. And for the first time in the spring, one of my colleagues in his research methods class actually started using badges and basically said, you know, students could earn a badge. And if you earn your badge and say writing in APA style, you don't have to do the 100 other assignments on APA style. And that's pretty cool. Yeah, exactly. That was their feeling. That's great, right? So find the right motivational tools. I mentioned Entwistle and surface processing. I think have students process deeply. And here quite simply means get them to think about stuff more than just at a surface level. Think about the meaning of what they're doing. Attach what they've talked, what they're reading to something else. And the good news is you can measure how people process stuff. Are you a deep processor or a surface processor? If you want to know, email me, I'll send you a link to the website where there's a little, but answer a bunch of questions and you can know once and for all, are you deep or surface? Now, why is this important? In another study we did with intro psych students across the nation, what we found is that, and the important part is right down here, we found that both self-predicted learning and quiz performance could be predicted by the students' deep approach. So similar to the other results that I showed you earlier on, if you know the extent to which somebody is processing at a deep or shallow level, you take a big step forward, okay? The good news is, as I wind down, there's a lot of stuff that we can point to, all right? And there's good news and bad news. The bad news is there's a lot of buzz or mythology out there on how people what they should do to learn, all right? Dunlowski and colleagues did the field a great service in a really neat review. And they looked at the top 10 things or techniques. Not that students use, mind you, but that cognitive science has found to be beneficial. All right, so they took these top 10 techniques, and then here are the same techniques, and it's Dunlowski and colleagues, and here's what they did. Based on numbers of studies, some in the classroom, some not in the classroom, they gave each of these 10 things a utility score. okay? A utility score. So that utility score is not just their opinion, but it's based on reading a number of studies done using that technique. And there were some surprises. Let me draw your attention to these low utility items. Look at some of those items. Highlighting. A lot of my students highlight. They will come in and say, Dr. Gurung, I studied so hard, but I only got a C. And I'll say, let's see your textbook. And more often than not, there's more highlight text on the page than unhighlighted text. And they go, look at all my highlighting. I'm like, yeah, look at all your highlighting, right? And so really that gets us to a really nice take-home message. If you asked most cognitive psychologists today, what are the 2 top techniques for learning? It's those 2 over there. Practice testing and distributed practice. Okay? I think either Science or Scientific American just published an article where they said instead of calling it practice testing, calling it affirmative testing, I think, or basically to get away from the bad sound of testing. Some people like to call this retrieval practice, so it doesn't sound like testing, right? But right now, cognitive science seems to suggest do these 2 things. Now, do students know about these things? Actually, they do. A colleague and I did some studies on it, and they do. Which brings me to my new acronym for what I'm going to do to try and cultivate learning. My goal is to be firm. All right, be firm. Facilitate learning, introduce new techniques, reward use, and here's the sticky part, actually mandate some use. All right? Most of these first few I've already touched on, right? What do I mean by facilitate learning? Well, here are some things you can do. There's a whole research out there. Email your students before class or after exams. It helps them be more motivated. To some extent, dress to impress. I have a couple of studies where what you wear actually, strangely, it shouldn't, but influences how motivated students are to learn in your class. All right? And building rapport. Rapport is a big deal. There's a really neat measure out there called the Learning Alliance Scale. And Rogers has found that if you build that learning alliance, they're going to work harder and learn harder. Okay? Wow, build rapport. It seems so, of course, but far too often we focus on content and not on things like this. Okay, that's the key here. So to facilitate learning, let's play up some of these other things. Introduce techniques. A student of mine and I just did a study where we took a look at a whole bunch of, we took a look at all those 10 learning techniques. And we found that actually students are doing it to a pretty large extent. And it looks like my data didn't come through, but it's there, right? Coming out, actually in the second issue, we put it out and we found that it's not that students don't know about it. Students know about those 10, all right? But what's interesting is when you measure them on all of those 10 techniques, it's really hard to find winners. It's really hard to find winners. And that's a challenge for the next step. It's nice knowing all these things, but how do we pull out some winners? Finally, or almost finally, what about rewarding use? I want to show you these. This is something that, this is the number of attempts students took on a quiz. The green bars are before I made any changes, namely reward them taking a quiz early. You may remember I mentioned, or you didn't, one of the key things about cognitive psych is getting students to practice often. Easily said than done. How do you do that? Oh, sir, please practice more often. Please practice more often. Yeah, I'm busy. All right? So I did something very simple. I told students, here's the deal. Your online quiz is open for 3 weeks. But if you take it at least 3 times in the first week that it's opened, I'll give you a bonus point. The green bars is before I said that. The blue bars is after I said that. Now you may say they're doing it for the bonus points. It doesn't matter why they're doing it. They're doing it. All right? Okay? Look at the number. The average attempts went up from about 45 to close to 125. That's a big jump in the number of attempts. Okay? And this is for a small class of 25 people. That's a lot of jump in attempts. And here's the funny thing. They didn't even ask me how much of a bonus. I said, you'll get a bonus. And they're like, oh, bonus. Bam! All right? And finally, when I say mandate activity, I mean mandate. I think we've been goody-goody too long. Oh, here's a nice thing. Here's a nice thing. Here's something that's somewhat controversial, but I'll say it. When we know so much about pedagogical science and what works and what doesn't work, in my book, it's almost unethical to not do some of this stuff. If we know taking online quizzes helps you learn, why wouldn't we do what we can to facilitate them taking it? And so I started mandating use. I said, yes, 10% of your grade, you have to do these online quizzes. Right? And I showed that over 3 different publishing companies' materials, the more they took it, controlling for their GPA. Controlling for their GPA. It's not just the smart students who are doing it more. Controlling for GPA, the more they practice the online quizzes, the better they did in the class. Okay? Now mind you, we are the bad guy. And I go back to saying, I'd much rather say, do this, you'll thank me later, than saying, don't do it, and you'll curse me later. Okay? You pick. I'd rather be thanked later than cursed later. Because I have heard students say, I wish so-and-so made me do that in class, because I wouldn't be in the position I am in now. All right? So mandating, it's a strong word, and we of academic freedom hate the word mandate. Right? But I use this guardedly. All right? I use it guardedly. There are certain things that we know seem to work really well. I think we can mandate it in our classes. So, in conclusion, all right, I think absolutely, as you can see in the last little bit, cognitive science and classroom research really goes together. All right, really goes together. And I think, there are lots of debates, and I'm looking forward to Jeff's talk tomorrow. There are a lot of debates about who's the scientist and who's the scholarly researcher and so on and so forth. And sometimes I don't even worry about those. And I go, look, it's not just the question of, it's not so much your way or my way. It's not so much cognitive science's way or the sciences of learning's way or my way. My nice take home is it's the way that works. So there's a lot out there. Some things work better than others, and hopefully you'll remember some of them the next time you need to help people learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regan. At this point, I think we're going to assemble our panel, which will consist of Dr. Patrick Dean, Arshad Ahmad, Robert Baker, Ken Steele, and Richard Wiggerson Pope. He did make it, Richard. If you could please come on up. So we have quite a diverse group up here. We have Patrick Dean, who's the president of McMaster University. Arshad Ahmad, who is the Associate Vice President of Teaching and Learning and the Director of the McMaster Institute for Innovation and Excellence in Teaching and Learning. We have Robert Baker, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Science. Richard Wiggers, who is Program Director of Research at the Higher Educational Quality Council of Ontario.
And Steele, who is a futurist and a person who thinks a lot about higher education trends. And to start off the panel, I gave them a question to think about, to consider, to reflect on Regan's presentation and the broader themes of this symposium. And the question that I gave to them was, what are the barriers to good teaching? So I'm going to give each of our panelists about 3 minutes or so to give some opening remarks. And then afterwards, I would be happy to open up to questions from the audience for anyone on the panel or our presenter, Dr. Regan Goering tonight. So I think we'll start off, I guess, with Patrick Dean on the end there. Or would you prefer to go last?
No, I can wait.
Okay, why don't we start with Patrick?
Thanks very much, Joe. So I did have some remarks I had prepared, but as is always the case in these situations, I find they're largely irrelevant. So I'm going to come at it from a different point of view. It's interesting, Joe's question, what gets in the way of effective teaching? In thinking about it, I approached from a multidisciplinary perspective. I mean, part of my job is, of course, to ensure that there's an engagement with the issue of outstanding teaching across all the disciplines of an institution like this. And that is in itself a challenging thing. So I'll go to that word, mindsets. So when Regan was talking about mindsets, I was struck by the relevance of the famous Thomas Kuhn essay on the structure of scientific revolutions and the notion that so long as you're only working within an existing paradigm, you're not going to discover things new to that paradigm. You're not going to discover things that challenge it. And as someone who comes from the humanities, it struck me that Regan was providing us with an extraordinarily persuasive model for a way of approaching teaching in psychology. But I wondered about the way in which that would translate, say, into my own discipline, where different questions have to be asked. I mean, if you were to say to a professor in English, you have to be doing the research in the classroom in order to be a more effective teacher, it's true. But the determinants of that research, the things that shape it, the kinds of questions that get asked in a humanities classroom will not be the same questions that Regan asked. Even though I, as someone who is actually really interested in the cognitive scientific side of this question, find it very, very illuminating and persuasive. One of the biggest challenges to the strengthening of the quality of learning in humanities classrooms is in fact the absence of a kind of an intellectual structure that facilitates that analysis. And that's an interesting thing. I mean, in some sense, mine is a discipline that works largely on intuitive insights about what's working in the classroom. So it's, in a way, what you got me thinking about was the importance of finding a way in which to take the model you laid out and find its applications across various disciplinary boundaries. Because so long as your mindset is brought to bear on the broader disciplinary mindset of a particular area of analysis, you're going to get outcomes that make sense within that discipline but are not easily translatable. That's, I think, a huge question. Because at a practical level, one of the biggest obstacles to people who teach the subject I teach is actually that there is no tradition of self-reflection on the actual mechanism of what you're doing. That's a tough thing. I mean, it's in the same way, think about outcomes. You laid out the desirability of identifying your outcome and arguing, or at least thinking backwards to what needs to be done to achieve it. That is not an inseparable or endemic assumption in disciplines that are very much, that justify themselves very much in terms of kind of broader metaphysical values. That's the big challenge. I'm going to leave it there, but I thought it perhaps useful to draw attention to the disciplinary specificity of the account that Regan gave us.
Why don't we move on to Richard? I was interested when you showed the diagram showing the factors of success in learning, and one of them was motivation. And it was interesting, several years ago, 10,000 university students in Ontario were asked what, for them, makes an effective instructor. And by far, the two most important factors that ranked in the 70 and 80 percentile was delivers interesting, well-prepared, and organized lectures, and is enthusiastic, entertaining, or motivating in the classroom. Yet we talked this afternoon about the fact that we do have some faculty who view teaching as a load and who seek teaching release because of the priority of research. And all of us, I think, at some point have had instructors who clearly were not motivated, were not enthusiastic, and didn't have that passion. And how do we impassion and motivate students if we're not equally passionate in front of class? Which brings me then to the students as well, because I teach in classrooms, and we have students in our classrooms in this generation of helicopter parents who don't know why they're there. And they're not sure. In fact, in some cases, they've been forced to take a major or a program that was not of their choice. And that is a challenge also for instructors and for our institutions. How do we motivate students who aren't even there by choice?
Thank you very much. I'm going to try try and focus my comments on science. As Patrick spoke more about humanities, I feel a little bit more comfortable talking about the sciences and my experience there. To my mind, when we're talking about the barriers for good teaching practice, to me, there is a very serious mismatch between our expectations for excellent teaching versus the interests of the people we hire to teach and the very strong culture surrounding their research expectations. I think I can illustrate that. I'm sure you all know that, but I think I can illustrate it by just talking about the development of a traditional science professor. They obviously start out as an undergraduate. They're going to enroll in a program. Let's say it's chemistry. I can pretty well guarantee you that they enroll in a program of chemistry because they're interested in the content of chemistry. They like chemistry. They can see themselves being a chemist sometimes. They're probably not coming into chemistry thinking, I would like to teach chemistry. I think that's going to be extremely rare. So for the next 4 years, they learn a whole lot of chemistry. It's content driven. Their success is driven by how much they know about the content of chemistry, and that's what they like. The next big hurdle is getting into graduate school. Can I get into graduate school? Are my marks high enough? Well, the marks have to be in chemistry content courses to get in. One of the things supervisors often look for is, did you do a 4th-year research project? Rarely in an undergraduate experience is enough time to actually practice teaching. Supervisors looking for grad students, frankly, don't care if you can teach or not. You might have to TA that person's course, but they really aren't looking for expertise in teaching. They're looking for depth of knowledge and passion in the subject. During the grad student period, sometimes they will have experiences in TA. Obviously, TAing has nothing to do with teaching in a whole class or developing it. And to be honest, an awful lot of students TA simply because they have to make ends meet, pay the bills, and many of them frankly resent it and they're not interested. After that, typically in science, you have to have a postdoc or fellowship before you're hired as a prof, all based on research. People hire postdocs based on their ability to do original research. Teaching is not a really important component of it. Sometimes postdocs will teach in a university as part of the program, but again, it's basically just to keep body and soul together. It's not part of what they're interested in. So then let's start getting closer to what really happens when we start hiring assistant professors, when we go through the search process. The search process is focused on research. We look at the number of papers, which journals are they in, what are the citation rates, what are the H factors, what are the plans for future research projects. We spend most of our time in searches, and I've sat literally on hundreds of search committees for faculty members. We talk about research. We frequently discard the majority of applications based on just looking at the publications in the CV. We don't even think about the teaching. If they don't have a lot of publications, they're gone. We don't even consider it. It's only when we start getting down to the short list that we start saying, well, can this person teach or not? And frequently we don't know because they've never had any opportunity to teach, they've never had any experience. And so sometimes it comes right down to saying, all we really know is that they give a good job simulator. That's the only thing we have to go with. That's it. And then it gets into the time when they're finally hired and they start as an assistant professor. And one of the first things that assistant professors always do is ask for teaching release. I don't want to get too much teaching, I want to get my lab up and running. And this is certainly encouraged by peers who tell them, focus on research while you're developing content. And there's no doubt that while university leaders, and I'm amongst them, say that teaching is as important as research, the reality is that achieving tenure is based largely on research, at least in the sciences. That's what gets you tenure. Pre-tenure colleagues are told by their peers to focus on research. I know one chair who has told young people in his department, I don't want to hear any complaints about your teaching, but I sure as hell also don't want to hear that you're a good teacher, because if you are, you're putting too much effort into it. That's going to hurt you in the long run. I've also had people say, don't take any grad students early on, hire postdocs, because they'll pump out more papers for you than training graduate students or undergraduate students. When it comes to actual tenure hearings, we have tons of information on the research. We have publication rates, again, H indices, grant size, all that sort of stuff. Lots of evidence to determine whether somebody's suitable or not. Where the portfolio on teaching is skimpy, might have teaching evaluations, but frankly, most people don't believe that they're actually useful. So there is way more information and emphasis put on teaching. And then, individuals themselves, even though they want to be good teachers, and many of them want to be good teachers, I don't want to cast a negative vote on all of them, many of them want to be good teachers. The trouble is they're so concerned about getting tenure, realizing it's on research, they don't think they can afford the time to be better teachers. I have heard many faculty members who say, I wrote that lecture at 2 o'clock this morning and give it at 9 this morning. I just don't have time to put the effort into it. And they don't put the time and effort into it, and we do need the time and effort, because they know it isn't going to count as much as research. So then finally, I would say, once we get tenure, everything's good, everybody's relaxed. I loved your comment about tenure helps and these sorts of things. It does. Some colleagues say, okay, now is the time to smarten up on my teaching. I think I need to spend some time preparing. But let's face it, you just spent the last 15 years focusing on research and development that component. To ask someone who's now got tenure, relatively secure, who's done little activity but focused on research, it is a really hard game to turn around, throw out all your old notes which you've used for the last couple of years, and start something entirely different. It's very, very difficult to ask people to do. And I think that's, to my mind, the largest barrier between excellence in teaching is the game is based on research, and we don't have much time or energy for teaching.
Well, I came with a page of notes, hoping that there'd be something left to say by the time I got to speak. I came up with 8 barriers that I think are major, and I've added a 9th after listening to Reagan's talk tonight. And as I'd hoped, the previous speakers have covered a couple of them, so I'll be very quick about it. But one advantage I have of being an independent consultant who works with institutions but isn't accountable to them, really, is I can say stuff nobody else wants to say. So I can say, for example, that I think one of the challenges to innovation in teaching in universities is that universities want to be centers of innovation, but actually are among the most conservative institutions in our society. I would say almost as conservative as the Roman Catholic Church, except that Pope Francis has really impressed me. I don't think any university president can hope to achieve any of the sorts of change that one pope is empowered to make. So I think conservativeness is one issue. I think the second one Patrick covered very well, and talked about being locked in a paradigm. I consider it that faculty tend to project themselves onto their students and assume the students are going to learn the same way that we learned, that the history, the sort of things we're comfortable with, lecture and so on, essay writing even, are appropriate metrics or appropriate approaches. The third, I think Rob covered really well, and Richard touched on as well, that tenure is the currency of the academy, that faculty's physical needs are covered by their salaries, as long as they're not contingent. And after that, tenure is the currency that you're working for, and it all hinges on research. So those are the first 3. Then the fourth, I think, is collective agreements, which most people can't touch on, but in a lot of institutions, what I hear about are collective agreements with faculty that limit class size, that constrain teaching loads, that put controls over class hours, or online or offline. Lecture capture is faculty intellectual property, all those sorts of things that get convoluted and legal and are frustrating. They sort of one more foot in the concrete, if you want, about why can't we move. Fifth is what I'm calling ego, but the idea I've got there is that when you look at what Harvard wants to do, when it wants to design the perfect, let's say, intro to psych course, they spend more than $100,000 on a MOOC course for edX for Harvard. They have 30 experts involved in designing that course. They have curriculum experts, they have evaluation experts, graphic designers, music composers, performance coaches, and yes, the faculty member who's the subject matter expert. But it's a team effort. I think the problem is that faculty egos get in the way of the idea that academic freedom means we can be professional researchers and amateur teachers. And the idea that professionals are going to help us with our teaching is, I shouldn't say are, because I don't do this anymore, but the idea that professionals are going to help faculty teach is offensive to them. So I think ego is the 5th issue. Budgets are the 6th. The way budgets are constructed tend to limit, they create class sizes, they limit what people can do. The 7th was about teacher evaluations, popularity, sort of being a driver for good teaching, and that doesn't always mean we're actually doing good teaching. And my 8th was that was about, I'm blaming registrar's offices, although it's more complicated than that, but the idea that we're trying to assess students in a not a formative but a summative way, that we're trying to assign a letter grade or a number to the student, that we're trying to evaluate them and put them on a curve, is I think a barrier to good teaching too. There have been some studies I've seen where you get 30% more learning if there are no grades involved, and if you give people comments but not grades. As soon as you add a grade to the comment, the power of the comment disappears. So anyway, I think registrars are enough. So what I came in with was, we're conservative, we project ourselves on our students, tenure is the reputation of currency, collective agreements get in the way, egos get in the way, budgets get in the way, the student evaluations get in the way, and the registrars and transcripts get in the way. And the ninth thing I think I'm inclined to add now is in a way connected to the registrars, but as Rita was saying, that we're focused on performance and not on learning. You know, what's the barrier to good learning is that we're trying to focus on good test scores from K to 12, and frankly on clinical sector. So those are 9 barriers I can think of.
Wow. Well, the only barrier I see right now is the lectern before me and you. And maybe so what I'll do to exaggerate that is I'll go right underneath here.
If you take the mic with you.
First point from down. I don't want anybody to see me. Well, the first point has to do with what Patrick said, so I want to elaborate on that just a little bit. Patrick was talking about disciplinarity, and so of course our institutions are built on academic disciplines, and so are many of the structures designed to support better teaching practice. So I think the first problem or barrier is that teaching and learning are not disciplinary. Okay, I'll come out of this place. That was kind of fun. So I wanted to share a little bit about the kind of space we live in. This is our the McMaster Institute for Innovation, Excellence in Teaching and Learning. So it's a teaching and learning center which had a very strong service mandate, being the second oldest in the country. And then more recently, in the last couple of years, we've been asked to, shift more towards the research mandate and come up with the kinds of things that Reagan was talking about in terms of the scholarship of teaching and learning. Not so much to do it within the center as much as to enable it across the campus. And so we try and do that. And so let me say, with respect to disciplinarity, this is a space that I would describe as a sort of a liminal space. You know, you're with the researchers, and you're also with the teachers and practitioners, and you're trying to mediate with a language that neither really wants to speak. And you don't really have any say, because at the end of the day, they're going to do what they're going to do anyways. That is with respect to pedagogical decisions. The hope we have, of course, is that we can influence them, and that we can inspire them sometimes to show them what's going on here and this part of the campus as to what might spark in their own courses. But the fact is that I think we don't do this seriously at all. I mean, if we were really serious about trying to evaluate teaching, in any campus, not just here, but anywhere in Canada, anywhere in the world, I'll put that out, I don't think we do it the way we're doing it right now. Because if we were to do research on teaching in the way we do research on other things that are life and death, we don't do it the way we kind of sort of shoot darts and do it in my opinion is this and what's yours. And really, I did a study here in this context with an N of 0. And what do you think? Do you think it can work in yours? So I think there's an issue about how serious we really are about the business of translation. So that's the first point. Let me move on to the second one, which has to do with translation itself. And Reagan really spoke very nicely and eloquently about that because of all the many confounding variables that come into play. But I think, as we heard from others, it's not just about the methodology, choosing the right methodology for the science, but it's really, it's more about some of the things we know that work and how do we scale them up so other people can enjoy them. So you have a study, it could be within a course, situated within a classroom or in a program. You actually could have a program, an entire program that really is the shining star for the faculty. You could have a faculty that, and I know this is the case at McMaster, you have amazing courses, you have amazing programs, you have amazing faculty. But how do you scale them up so every student gets a chance to enjoy them? And the issue of scaling with translation work has to do with really doing a lot more than what we're doing right now. So I'll end with the final point, and that has to do with your point, Ken, about conservatism. I really think that
I have it on mute, but that's still on.
so if we're talking about innovation and we're talking about risk, well, that would mean, in my mind, that we have to allow for failure. And how often are we doing that? At any level. You could talk about failure in terms of learning, you could talk about failure in terms of design, you talk about failure in terms of program failures. How honest are we in allowing failure? And I think really this is a question of space, this is a question of time, and probably the most significant barrier in development for good teaching is just that, tolerance for failure.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time, and I think the panelists really covered things well. I'm going to nail it down or boil it down to something really brief, which is when you hear us all talking, I think when you think about what is good teaching, I'm not sure enough people have the full answer to that. That's a tough question. What is good teaching? Right? So we as a field, as people caring about teaching, really have to do some work on going way beyond just course evaluations. What is good teaching? If more people knew, maybe they'd have more to strive towards. Along that line of striving, here's the big problem as I see it. Not enough reward, and quite honestly, no punishment. If you're not a good teacher, you can actually make it by. So, as somebody who remembers my intro psych learning, punishment not good for long-term learning, let's work on rewarding those teachers.
I'd like to open it up to the audience for a few questions. Yeah, right at the back, and then we'll go to Charlie.
I liked your illustration right at the very beginning with the young child, because it reminds us that the young child with Bowlby, Study, and Spitz, that the greatest learning occurs right in the first years of life with the mother and the family. So learning is social, and it enters, school is a social way. And I think the social model is the best way of looking at learning, like tutorials, where it's responsible, where students are responsible for evaluating each other. And maybe the tutor is responsible for process. And I think that that's a much better way of looking at education. I think in teaching, get out of the way. Kids want to learn. That little girl wanted to learn. She was so eager to learn. Students come eager to learn. And I think sometimes we just perform antics while students learn. And the real learning, if it doesn't come from the student, it's not going to come.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. I think that was the one key takeaway I took from one of the many, but one of the key takeaways I took from this presentation was that 26% of the learning is the instructor, 53% is the student, whatever that means. And in that sense, it means what we've heard in studies about Indigenous Aboriginal peoples in post-secondary. It's like the battle is being lost long before they get to university. The battle is being lost in grade 1, K to 12. And so whatever makes up that 53% of success when they get to university is still got to be disentangled, I suppose, but it's what happens in preschool.
Well, I'd just like to add, I think you really interesting point when you use the word social, because there's no doubt teaching is a social activity that works best in a certain social milieu. If I go back to focusing on scientists, they're not always interested in people. Many of them are frankly not necessarily people. And so we've had Joe and Reagan give compelling talks. These are people. They're good at it. I know of fantastic scientists who cannot speak like these individuals. They just can't. And they often feel very uncomfortable in social situations. I know scientists who have quit their careers because they simply can't stand up and talk to more than 3 or 4 people at a time. So this, I think, is another barrier to excellence in education, is that it is a social process, and sometimes our very brightest people in certain research areas don't have the social skills to actually do it.
I think social is being used in 2 ways. One, social in everyday common sense, in common parlance, and then social, it's a basic way that we relate as human beings. And I think even the great physicists related to each other in a social way, although it may not be amicable.
Engaged, produce meaning, and have social interaction. So if you really look at it, lots of people have said that. Take Paul Prairie, Silas McFarlane, Mario Montessori, or even Rapport. All the British teachers have said essentially the same thing. So I guess the barriers that stand there are something even more time-honored. I was thinking of Bacon when he talked about the idols that stand in the way of real learning. The idols of the cave, the tribe, the theater, and the marketplace, they all are there. Nothing as much has changed. I mean, the determinants of change, we have Twitter and Twitter and this and that, but nothing really has changed. And the other point I was going to make is that you pointed out something about the registrar's office and so on. There's another problem with our evaluation system. I don't think what really stands in the way of real learning are deadlines. I have in my course outline that the deadline truly should be met when you're really done. But in the absence of any instructions from her who has made us, I simply go by what the registrar says. And I often, in many of my courses, give students an incomplete. And you say, you finish this when you want to, I'll change them off later on. Just to meet the transcript, I give an incomplete allegiance. When you feel ready to hand me off, because I seriously believe that deadlines stand in the way of learning.
That's interesting.
John and I have spoken about this many times. And it's interesting, when Regan began his talk, I mean, we all begin this discussion with certain assumptions that we don't question, which is that learning occurring in places that are essentially institutionalized mechanisms intended to produce learning may not be the ideal setting in which to do this. And if you go through the remarks we've each made, Rob, I thought, brilliantly drew attention to the circumstantial obstacles to good learning occurring. And I could list any number. In fact, most of the things we've spoken about are things we seem to want to believe are incidental irritants that get in the way of the grand project we're engaged in. But they are in some sense inseparable from the institutionalized context in which we do it. So at the root of this, there is a huge question to be asked about the relationship between social institutions and the success of those institutions at realizing the potential of the human beings who come into them. I said we had a really wonderful seminar at Niagara on the Lake last summer, I think, when I last fall, was it not sure? And at that meeting, I just commented in passing, I hadn't thought it through very much, but I commented just on how much of what we do when we sit around to talk about improving the quality of learning, that is really stuff we're doing to compensate for what is actually an endemic characteristic of places like this. It's just a thought. It's by no means clear to me that the outcome, if we got it all right, of institutionalized learning would be the best thing for human beings. We're going to keep the institution, believe me. That's the question that you have to really ask, that very, very fundamental question, in order to begin to free yourself, to take the risks, as Arshad suggested, to ask really, really fundamental questions about deadlines, about grades, about methods of faculty evaluation, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's a wonderful experiment going on, Chai. You'd be interested in this business of deadlines, and I want to pick up on something said earlier about the enormous amount of attention, resources, and money that goes into, say, preparing for a course like Harvard and MOOC, for instance. You know, that suggests the intentionality behind the design and what that brings to the table, and how important those elements are. So one of the things they found, as everyone knows in this room, is that these massive open online courses have very low completion rates, very low. But remarkably, they're changing in two areas, and I mean significantly changing, where something like 3 out of 4 or 80% complete. One of those environments in which this happens are something called on-demand courses. So on-demand courses deal exactly with this point you raise, that people start and they complete when they can, not because of when the instructor decides or when the registrar decides. And because there is so much demand for the course, there's always peers available who you can interact with and learn from, which is very important. And the other thing that is sort of related with the completion is the emphasis on measurement and skill-based learning, as opposed to some of the things Patrick was talking about earlier on, which have to do with paradigm shifts and ways of thinking and meaning and understanding and epistemologies and so on and so forth. So the more skill-based, and these are now on demand out there, you've got a new model that really is attracting a lot of people, in the hundreds of thousands, if not in the millions. Minus, of course, the first comment made about the social aspect, which is still not even close to what we would do when we see each other face to face, which doesn't happen online.
Richard?
I have to play a bit of a devil's advocate on this. I am an instructor who takes deadlines very seriously. My worry is, as I understand it, in Ontario high schools, there are no deadlines, and there's a lot of flexibility for students. But I see students missing the deadline for a job application, if they miss the deadline for their interview, and if they get that job and they can't do the work in the timeline they're given, they need to learn that at some point. And I do think it should be part of the process. I'm not saying it has to be everywhere. And in fact, my compromise is, if I'm the one instructor they have who treats deadlines very seriously, and I'll take the hits for it, I'm fine with that. But as long as they have some exposure to the reality that will be there when they leave the institution.
Well, I'm not opposed to deadlines. I always said that deadlines stand in the way of learning. The deadlines are very useful when you have to catch a plane and go off. Deadlines are only for the real world. But I think the university, we should encourage being in the unreal world of your exam.
We'll give the final word to Ken.
Oh, I didn't mean to have the final word. As an English major, I certainly learned about negotiating for extensions. But to follow on Arshad's point, I think one of the exciting big picture potential changes is if we move away from this concept that we give you a semester, we cut you off, and how much you've mastered is the number you get on the grade curve. And if instead we say, here's the 300 badges you can learn about chemistry. Go to it, and it becomes gamified, as Regan was alluding to. And you just keep leveling up. You don't have to stop. I think if we could shift our attention away from grading on a curve within a curriculum that's time limited, and instead say, it doesn't matter, what your achievement is within the time. It matters that you've mastered this stuff eventually in whatever sequence you want, and interdisciplinarity. I mean, there's a bunch of things about our structure that really constrain the pursuit of your curiosity because it's not on the curriculum. You're stuck within the course.
I'd like to thank Dr. Goering and our distinguished panel for a really enlightening discussion. And as promised by Dr. Goering, we've doubled the amount of wine and cheese available. So please do join us for some continued discussion. Thank you very much.